and welcome to DM Tools with MaxMcCool. If you're listening to this episode of Monsters Manifested on YouTube, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe to my channel, as I'll be uploading new episodes of Monsters Manifested as frequently as possible. On today's episode of Monsters Manifested, we're going to be covering Blights. So, without further ado, let's get right into it. Blights cover pages 31 and 32 of the Monsters Manual, and their lore goes as follows. Awakened plants gifted with the powers of intelligence and mobility, blights plague lands contaminated by darkness. Drinking that darkness from the soil, a blight carries out the will of ancient evil and attempts to spread that evil wherever it can. Roots of the Gulthias Tree. Legends tell of a vampire named Gulthias, who worked terrible magic and raised up an abominable tower called Nightfang's Spire. Gulthias was undone when a hero plunged a wooden stake through his heart, but as the vampire was destroyed, his blood infused the stake with a dreadful power. In time, tendrils of new growth sprouted from the wood, growing into a sapling infused with the vampire's evil essence. It is said that a mad druid discovered the sapling, transplanting it to an underground grotto where it could grow. From this Gulthias tree came the seeds from which the first blights were sown. Well, that's pretty cool. Pretty interesting stuff. So, blights are presented with a bit of an origin story in the monster manual, it seems. They have come from the blackened, toxified, corrupted blood of this legendary vampire, which could be a cool little bit of historical lore that you could implement into your campaign if you wanted to. But let's move on. Dark Conquest. Wherever a tree or plant is contaminated by a fragment of an evil mind or power, a Gulthias tree can rise to infest and corrupt the surrounding forest. Its evil spreads through root and soil to other plants, which perish or transform into blights. As those blights spread, they poison and uproot healthy plants, replacing them with brambles, toxic weeds, and others of their kind. In time, an infestation of blights can turn any land or forest into a place of corruption. In forests infested with blights, trees and plants grow with supernatural speed. Vines and undergrowth rapidly spread through buildings and overrun trails and roads. After blights have killed or driven off their inhabitants, whole villages can disappear in the space of days. Oh, that's cool, man. You could definitely implement a nice kind of creepy, spooky vibe here with an overgrown forest or something that's kind of encroaching upon a town or a village or anything like that. Let's continue. Controlled by evil. Blights are independent creatures, but most act under a Gulthias tree's control, often displaying the habits and traits of the life force or spirit that spawned them. By attacking their progenitor's old foes or seeking out treasures valuable to it, they carry on the legacy of long-lost evil. Alright, so they've given you, so far in the general lore, they've given you an origin, and they give you a little bit of behavior patterns in terms of how they act, and they give you a little bit of information on how they passively affect the environment around them. So there's a nice amount of information there that you can use to sort of set the stage, if you would, for an adventure that involves blights. Now, moving on to the specific types of blight. We'll begin with the needle blight. In the shadows of a forest, needle blights might be taken at a distance for shuffling, hunched humanoids. Up close, these creatures reveal themselves as horrid plants whose conifer-like needles grow across their bodies in quivering clumps. A needle blight lashes out with these needles or launches them as an aerial assault that can punch through armor and flesh. When needle blights detect a threat, they loose a pollen that the wind carries to other needle blights throughout the forest. Alerted to their foe's location, needle blights converge from all sides to drench their roots in blood. That's cool. So the needle blights behave almost like when there's some form of danger or confrontation towards a singular needle blight, it emits this kind of pheromone spore through the air, alerting all the other ones in a similar way to how animals or insects like bees and stuff do when there's a predator kind of in and around the vicinity. Moving on to the twig blight. Twig blights can root in soil, which they do when living prey are scarce. While rooted, they resemble woody shrubs. When it pulls its roots free of the ground to move, a twig blight's branches twist together to form a humanoid-looking body with a head and limbs. Twig blights seek out campsites and watering holes, rooting there to set up ambushes for potential victims coming to drink or rest. Huddled together in groups, twig blights blend in with an area's natural vegetation or with piles of debris or firewood. Given how dry they are, twig blights are particularly susceptible to fire. Very cool. So you've got a bit more of a wooden, dry wood kind of bramble-focused blight with the twig blight, which could turn out to be pretty chaotic if your players can manage to get creative with how they decide or choose to deal with a blight like a twig blight, but we'll get into that later on. For now, let's move on to the vine blight. Appearing as masses of slithering creepers, vine blights hide in undergrowth and wait for prey to draw near. By animating the plants around them, vine blights entangle and hinder their foes before attacking. Vine blights are the only blights capable of speech. Through its connection to the evil spirit of the Gulthius tree it serves, a vine blight speaks in a fractured version of its dead master's voice, taunting victims or bargaining with powerful foes. And a little bit of flavor text here. Behold the legacy of Gulthius the vampire, plants with a taste for blood. So, all in all, some pretty interesting lore in regards to blights. They're actually quite cool, I think, for a type of creature. And surprisingly, it seems as though none of them are considered undead or anything like that. They're all considered plants. And I'm already thinking up different potential means of implementing blights in an adventure. But yeah, I think that there's a lot here that could be done with blights. So without further ado, let's move on to the stat blocks. The Needle Blight is a medium plant with a neutral evil alignment. It has an armor class of 12, which is natural armor. It has hit points that average 11 or 2d8 plus 2. And it has a speed of 30 feet. The Needle Blight has a strength of 12, a dexterity of 12, a constitution of 13, an intelligence of 4, a wisdom of 8, and a charisma of 3. It is immune to the blinded and deafened conditions. It has senses of blind sight for 60 feet, in which it is blind beyond that radius, and it has a passive perception of 9. The languages it can speak are none, however, it understands common, and it is a challenge rating of 1/4. On to the actions. Claws are a melee weapon attack with a +3 to hit, a reach of 5 feet on one target. On a hit, it does an average of 6 or 2d4 plus 1 piercing damage. Needles, ranged weapon attack with a +3 to hit, a range of 30 to 60 feet on one target. On a hit, it does an average of 8 or 2d6 plus 1 piercing damage. Onto the Twig Blight. The Twig Blight is a small plant, also with a neutral evil alignment. It has an armor class of 13 with hit points that average at 4 or 1d6 plus 1. It has a movement speed of 20 feet. The Twig Blight has a strength of 6, a dexterity of 13, a constitution of 12, an intelligence of 4, a wisdom of 8, and a charisma of 3. Its skills include stealth +3. It is vulnerable to fire type damage. It is immune to the blind and deafened condition. It has senses of blind sight, in which, once again, it is blind beyond that radius. And it has a passive perception of 9. The Twig Blight also cannot speak, but understands the language of common. It is a challenge rating of 1/8. As for the ability of the Twig Blight, it has false appearance. While the blight remains motionless, it is indistinguishable from a dead shrub. And for the action, Claws is a melee weapon attack with a +3 to hit, a reach of 5 feet on one target. On a hit, it does an average of 3 or 1d4 plus 1 piercing damage. And finally, onto the Vine Blight. The Vine Blight is also a medium plant with a neutral evil alignment. It has an armor class of 12, hit points that average 26 or 4d8 plus 8. It has a movement speed of 10 feet. The Vine Blight has a strength of 15, a dexterity of 8, a constitution of 14, an intelligence of 5, a wisdom of 10, and a charisma of 3. Its skills include stealth +1, and it is immune to the blind and deafened condition. It also has the sense of blind sight for 60 feet, in which it is blind beyond that radius, along with a passive perception of 10. The language a Vine Blight can speak is Common. It is a challenge rating of 1/2. The Vine Blight also has the false appearance ability, where while the blight remains motionless, it is indistinguishable from a tangle of vines. Onto the actions. Constrict is a melee weapon attack with a +4 to hit, a reach of 10 feet on one target. On a hit, it does an average of 9 or 2d6 +2 bludgeoning damage, and a large or smaller creature is grappled, requiring an escape DC of 12 in order to successfully escape the grapple. Until this grapple ends, the target is restrained, and the blight cannot constrict another target. Entangling Plants. Recharge on a 5 or 6. For those of you who are unfamiliar, recharge on a 5 or 6, what that means is on the Vine Blight's turn, the Dungeon Master will roll a d6. If they roll the d6 and it lands on either a 5 or 6, this ability or action regenerates and comes back, and the Vine Blight can use this ability once again on its turn as an action. Grasping roots and vines sprout in a 15-foot radius centered on the blight, withering away after 1 minute. For the duration, that area is difficult terrain for non-plant creatures. In addition, each creature of the blight's choice in that area, when the plants appear, must succeed on a DC 12 strength saving throw or become restrained. A creature can use its action to make a DC 12 strength check, freeing itself or another entangled creature within reach on a success. And that's it for the blights in terms of lore and stats. I think that these are actually really cool creatures, like very cool monsters that could be used in an adventure. You could probably create a whole campaign around this. I don't know that I would personally, but I would definitely use them for a solid leg of an adventure, right from the start, if you wanted to start your players off on some spooky, scary stuff type thing. So, without further ado, let's move on to some encounter building. Immediately, the first thing that comes to mind for me in terms of implementing blights in an encounter would be using them in the beginning of a campaign as sort of the initial enemies that your players would face, and you can make it work quite well. Now, due to the challenge ratings of the blights, they are pretty low in terms of CR. So you have 1/8, 1/2, and 1/4, I believe. Yeah. So effectively, a needle blight could be defeated by one level 1 player character, which is effectively what the 1/4 challenge rating means. So with that being the case, a challenge rating of 1/8 means that on average, a player character would be able to overcome 2 of the twig blights. With the Vine Blight, at first level, you could use 2 of them, and a party of 4 should be able to take them on without too much issue. So, the way that I would implement the blights, the lore for them is actually pretty great. So, I could see this being done as a starting adventure, as like a session 1, and the players make their way to the town either individually or together, and this is their first quest, if you would. Now, I would implement this or these encounters or scenarios as almost like a side quest that occurs while the players are there. So they have a task or an objective presented to them in one way, shape, or form, and part of that task begins with them making their way to whichever town it is that they're going to. And now once they arrive at that town to seek out what main quest it is that you have set up for them, you would have them arrive at this town, and this town is being accosted effectively by what appears to be nature, right? You could even set it up so that as they're making their way through the woods, where they would expect the tree line to thin out and the canopy to become lighter and stuff like that, it in fact actually becomes heavier and darker and thicker and more oppressive as they make their way towards the town. And then finally they can make it to the town, and they can see that already the town is kind of encircled by these strange growths, right? You could even differentiate the plant growth in the area, like, as they're traveling through the woods on the road, on the trade route or what have you, to make their way to this town. There's these strange, almost like, I get a very heavy or a very strong swamp feel from these blights. I get kind of a swampy vibe. So I would say I would implement a bit of description in the way that, like, there's these trees and heavy plant growth all over the place, but something about it feels out of order, like out of the norm. There's strange vines and, shrubbery that doesn't quite seem to be appropriate for the location, like geographically, right? For where they are, for the biome that they're in. And I would kind of play it up in that way. And once they get to town, they're told of, or they find out through rumors or gossip about perhaps some crazed scientist. You could do a real Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde thing here, where you have a crazed scientist or some botanist, some naturalist or herbalist that has been experimenting with plants and this and that for the past number of years, perhaps the past 5 or 10 years. And they're all blaming this person as the cause of the aggressive encroachment of the plants of nature, basically, that's overtaking almost the town. And the players can decide to make their way to the scientist or what have you in order to interrogate them, or perhaps curry some favor or information from them so that they can help remedy the situation. Now, you could implement it in such a way that perhaps the scientist or alchemist or whatever you choose to use has been corrupted and become maddened by their experiments and by the influence of these corrupted plants, and has gone off into hiding, perhaps somewhere in the woods or something to that effect, in which you could actually do a pretty cool thing where you have a recurring villain, if you would, for the first tier maybe of your adventures, where they're now kind of on this manhunt trying to find this crazed individual who's corrupting the woods and corrupting nature with these, whatever it is they're using, and infecting and threatening towns all over the land. And the players would go through the woods and, they would see these trees that are out of place. They'd look around and everything would still seem to be normal or natural. Out of place, there's something off, but these vines look like vines, these shrubs look like shrubs, until some movement occurs or there's some sort of action or confrontation or conflict. Now, you could spin that a couple of ways, even with the mad scientist character archetype, if you would, and perhaps the individual is in fact a mad scientist and is corrupting nature and the woods and all of that stuff. And perhaps their dark experimentation with nature and herbalism manages to corrupt them into this strange kind of druidic hag of sorts. And now they're this individual that lives in the forest in this wooded area, and the players have been charged with the task of going in there and clearing out the forest and doing away with this hag. So you could stretch it out that way. Perhaps the town or the forest around the town is rumored to be cursed or has a legend of being cursed because there's some terrible witch that lives by a lake or a pond in the center of the forest, and the witch has cursed the town because they ran the witch out or tried to burn the witch at the stake, and the witch cursed the town to forever be in conflict with nature itself. Right? So this town is just cursed with these blights that come up, and maybe they slowly take over more and more of the town. Perhaps they come in at night and capture victims or, even small animals or livestock and pull them into the forest so that they can feed off of the life force of these creatures. You could even create a pretty cool adventure there, or a couple of adventures there, where the players effectively are traversing through this thick forest that seems just gnarled and twisted and corrupted and out of place. And as they're making their way through, you could have them come into contact with creatures and animals that perhaps themselves are corrupted. You could set up maybe a pack of wolves or a bear or something like that, a couple of bears. that encounter the adventurers while they're resting maybe in the forest, seeking out this mad scientist or witch or hag. And as the bears approach them and they make note and come into contact with the bears or wolves or whatever kind of woodland creatures you would go for, you can see that they have perhaps twisted and spiraled out fangs or claws, or maybe there are spikes or horns coming out of them that seem unnatural or out of the norm, right? And you can kind of flavor in a lot of kind of like warped and twisted and kind of like perverted nature, you know? This kind of corrupted nature that has made the monsters or made the creatures in the forest become a lot more aggressive and a lot more brazen, let's say. So if you go the route of the witch or the hag and something like that, you can have an evil villain. You can have a large main villain that at such a low level, the party will probably not be able to overcome right then and there, but it would also give them an incentive to come back to that town and maybe deal with the hag or the witch or the scientist, what have you. Now, since they use the Gulthias tree to propagate and generate and create these blights, you could place the Gulthias tree somewhere, perhaps behind the witches or the hag's hut or den, and they have to get through them in order to destroy the tree itself. You know, you could set the Gulthias tree in some deep, dark area in the center of the forest. You could place the Gulthias tree perhaps on top of a cliff or something like that, and its corruption through its roots is just feeding everything, right? So the Gulthias tree is a cool little element to this because you could use a much higher level monster as the main antagonist for the corruption of the forest or of the piece of nature that has been corrupted, and the players can entirely circumvent that if they're crafty enough, if they can figure out essentially what the generator of these blights and this corruption is. So that's one cool way, I think, that you can use kind of the environment and the lore provided from blights or about blights to create a nice lower level adventure for your players and give them a little bit of thread or a little bit of breadcrumbs as to what a larger kind of overarching goal for them may be. Right, which would be to namely take out the much more deadly villain or antagonist that they might be in over their heads if they were to choose to take them on right at this very moment at the level that they were at. Another way you could play it, and I think this would be pretty cool, is you could play it as, if you went the mad scientist route, you could play it as a mad scientist, herbalist or naturalist, something like that, an alchemist, that has somehow come into the possession of the Gulthias stake and somehow managed to replicate it or perhaps extract something from it, extract an essence from it, and effectively create a series of Gulthias stakes. You know, like perhaps the herbalist or the mad scientist villain went mad with their studies of this in an attempt to rejuvenate or reinvigorate the woods and the forests and stuff like that, realized that the Gulthias stake could do that, and they extracted some aspect or some form of essence from the stake, and they've managed to contain it all in little vials perhaps. And perhaps this mad scientist or mad alchemist or what have you just goes around the realm, goes around the land, and throws vials of this essence into the woods, into the forest, just pours it out wherever they pass, and causes the growth of just a multitude of Gulthias trees. And you can create a whole region that's been corrupted by these blights, and without necessarily having an evil villain or a large antagonist in any of them. It's just the tree itself has been growing there and has been corrupting the lands all around, all throughout the region. So you could do it that way, and then the players kind of constantly have to encounter these blights and their variants. And it seems to me that these three types of blights are effectively suggested to be used together as a triumvirate or a trifecta of blight types, right? You could separate them into individual types if you wanted to stretch this out over a few different adventures, where the first adventure, let's say, involves mostly twig blights, the blights that are susceptible to fire, which in and of itself cause some chaos and havoc, because if your players set one of them on fire, you could very easily have a blight run off into the woods and just ignite everything, in which, good news, the Golthius tree will probably be burnt down. Bad news, the rest of the forest will probably be burnt down. But you could make it work like that. And then on the next adventure through the forest or through another forest, you then could implement the needle blights, which are a little tougher. They're not susceptible to catching fire. They can fire from ranged areas, which is pretty good. You could create almost like a stealthy funhouse type thing where as they're walking through, they have to make dex saves. And if the dex save is higher than the needle blight's ranged attack, they dodge it. And if it's not as high as the ranged attack of the needle blight, the needles puncture them, doing some damage. And you can describe to them that they basically get impaled by these oddly large and anomalously sized coniferous needles, like from a pine tree, that are just jutting out from their armor, their leather, And then you could create a third adventure where it's all corrupted environment, woods or forest or what have you, swamp, anything like that is entirely infested with vine blights, which are a little tougher, and they look like a tangle of vines, and, they can constrict and create rough terrain and stuff like that for your players. But it seems to me that the intent is for a dungeon master to use them all in a singular adventure or in a singular environment. And effectively, the way I would run this would be, the closer they are to civilization, the closer that the party is to a city or town as they enter the forest, the weaker the blight would be. So I would go for something like the twig blights. Then as they progress deeper into the woods and into the thicker, darker canopy section of the forest, now they would come into contact with twig blights and needle blights. They would start manifesting in and around there. Then as the players effectively made their way closer and closer and closer to the location of the Golthius tree, that's when I would implement more stark and drastic changes and contrasts, where the forest would become more swamp or bog-like, and there's more vines, and maybe the trees go from these coniferous trees like pine trees and stuff of that nature to like weeping willows that, are kind of hung over a lake or a pond. And even in the center of that pond or lake, I would place the Golthius tree kind of growing out of it. Perhaps there's a little mound in the center of it, and the Golthius tree is sprouted out from there, and you can see as its branches kind of reach out in all directions to every inch and corner of the forest itself. And that's when I would start implementing the twig blights, needle blights, and vine blights. And you can create a very cool, creepy, and I hazard to say this, but almost zombies without being zombies encounter or scenario for your players. Now, the cool thing about this and the implementation, I think, of using a scientist or mad alchemist, something of that nature, that's kind of just running around and just throwing vials of this essence into the woods, is that you effectively give your players a through line for their questing as they are making their way through your campaign setting or your world. They have a through line of cleansing the wilderness of these blights and of this corruption, whilst they are following through with whatever other main quests they may have, right? So it constantly gives the players a drive to move forward and continue adventuring and questing, because there will always be another environment that has been corrupted by the essence of the Golthius tree. And inevitably at the end of the adventures or campaign, or where you choose to finish off that leg, you can then have the scientist or mad alchemist or what have you that has effectively perhaps been so corrupted themselves from their exposure to the Golthius essence that there's some form of strange corrupt being, right? Some form of strange corrupt being, like perhaps they themselves have become a hag, or perhaps they've just become this kind of strange, warped, druidic character, like the original mad druid that took the stake of Golthius and created the first Golthius tree. This also works very well for you as a dungeon master, because no matter what's going on, or no matter what your adventurers are doing, what your players choose to do in your game, you always have an adventure at the ready. You always have a fallback for times where maybe you've had a little bit of burnout, or you're unsure of where to take them next or what to set them up with next. You always have this kind of overarching task that the players have of clearing out and cleansing the wilderness of this kind of corruption involving the blights. And it can remain relevant to your party for quite a number of levels, right? I mean, all of a sudden, once the party is level 3 or 4, let's say, even level 5, any individual blight would not be a challenge to them. But that doesn't mean that there's only one blight or one of each type of blight in these corrupted areas, right? And the longer the characters take to get to those areas, the more corrupt it becomes, which means the more blights potentially have generated. So even at 3rd to 5th level, though one blight or one of each type of blight would not be a very big challenge to them, all of a sudden you can create hordes and hordes and hordes. You can just generate huge swaths of blights in an environment that has become so brutally and drastically corrupted by the Gulthius tree that is within it, that it's just infested with these types of blights all over the place. And then you can even still implement a large antagonist if you would, right? You could implement the witch or the hag or the mad scientist or any other creature. Maybe the main antagonist in one of them is a corrupted animal type. Perhaps there's a herd of bugbears that are residing in one of these forests, and the bugbears have become twisted and corrupted from living and eating and drinking from these tainted lands. You could even do something to the effect of perhaps you have treants or like tree creatures, sentient tree beings, and they request the assistance of the adventurers while the adventurers are on their way, along a road. They request or beseech the party to assist them because their forest has been corrupted. And perhaps the main antagonist for that adventure is a treant that's been corrupted and is now on the side of the blights and the Gulthius tree itself, right? So there's a lot of ways that you could go about using blights, I think. I think they're a very cool, very interesting and unique set of first level, starting level monster types that a DM could use to very good effect with their players for their adventure to start out. And I think it could be a very good way to start a campaign off strong, really. But that's all I've got for you folks today. Thank you very much for tuning in to this episode of Monsters Manifested. Next week's episode, we'll be covering, bugbears. Very cool. Getting into goblinoid types, I suppose. If you're listening to this episode on YouTube, once again, I'd kindly ask that you subscribe, like, and comment, and all of that stuff. I'd appreciate it. I appreciate all of you for listening in and tuning in to these episodes, and I'm excited to bring you folks the next one. Until then, have a good day, everyone.